Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Aisha Little, and I am the co-founder of the Midwest Black Speculative Fiction Alliance. And this is our third program for Black Fae May, Black Folklore as Black Speculative Fiction. And I wanted to bring on some Midwest BSFA supporters and some of my favorite folks to kind of talk through this topic with us. First is Dr. Cassandra Jones, who is a professor at the University of Cincinnati in the Africana Studies department.
Assistant professor, I should clarify.
Assistant professor.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate the promotion, but I'm
I feel like they should fix that. That's
what did I say? Did I say? I thought I said professor. Just
yeah.
Assistant professor. And also Tonia Ransom, who is the co-host and creator of the NIGHTLIGHT podcast, which is a fantastic horror podcast if you're interested in horror. So, ladies, take it away. I will let you introduce yourselves individually. A little bit of background information.
Sure. I, as you mentioned, I'm assistant professor of Africana Studies. My work is on Black women's use of memory and speculative fiction. So that's sort of how my interest is merging here. And I've done a little bit of work on Gullah culture, and I lived in South Carolina for 7 years. Some of my people are from South Carolina, so I have some connection there. So this was an interesting topic for me to explore. Tonia, how about you?
I'm Tonia Ransom. I'm the creator and executive producer of NIGHTLIGHT, a horror podcast that features creepy tales written by Black writers from all over the world. And I'm here because obviously, I publish speculative fiction on my podcast, primarily focused on horror. A lot of it's based on African and African American folklore. And I'm just super excited to be here to talk with Dr. Jones. It's super exciting.
Yeah, same. So I thought just to kind of get us all on the same page, I talk a little bit about what African American folklore and what sort of speculative fiction is, and then we could just kind of get into it and share a couple stories and talk about some of the tropes and figures, the fae figures who show up in African and African American folklore, and sort of related to our own experiences. So when I say African American folklore, what I mean are these sort of traditional stories, the oral tradition, songs, superstitions, customs, tales, fables, that kind of thing that come from this sort of Afro-diasporic perspective. It's for us in the United States, this comes from an amalgamation of African, indigenous, and also European sources through that history of the transatlantic slave trade. We've got, so some examples are, the kind of animal tales that you might have heard of, Anansi, the spider, or Brer Rabbit, and those kinds of trickster figures who, although are sort of physically weaker, are able to, turn the tables on their opponents and use their wits to outsmart them. So a lot of these stories were captured in the oh boy, captured is a terrible is a terrible word there, but recorded through works at Hampton, and this large process of gathering folk tales that happened there in the 19th and 20th century. Also a lot of folklorists capturing stories through in the 1930s that way. So that gives a sense of those sorts of things we're going to be talking about. When I say speculative fiction, what I mean, I'm talking about Black speculative fiction particularly. And these are sort of stories that come from science fiction or fantasy, magic realism, that can kind of reflect some of our current anxieties, our preoccupations, can discuss some of the injustices that we're facing historically, currently, and can project into the future, extrapolating from things that are happening now or things that have happened historically. those sorts of stories that also, again, are grounded in this Black history, Black culture, that can be both forward looking but also backward looking, to kind of take from what's happened historically and understand the kind of material experiences that people had, but then use imagination to project kind of an interiority, right, and really get a sense of what it would be like as a human to live in those times, things that are left out of history books. So those, the sort of speculative fiction has that power to subvert our expectations and change the way we think about things. Darko Suvin talks about that as kind of cognitive estrangement, right? That it just has that ability to shift our framework just enough so that we consider things in a new way. And I think that is a place where we see similarities between African American folklore and speculative fiction. That there's that, in the speculative fiction, we've got the kind of what if story, or if this goes on type story. But in African American folklore, there's what's referred to as a pourquoi tale, right, which means why in French. But both of them are attempting to understand why the world is the way that it is. How did we get here? How can we make sense of what's happening or what has happened to lead us up to this moment? So I think that is part of the power of both of these things. And we can really think about these as similar types of storytelling that emerge from the same place, but we just are using slightly different language to talk about them and think about the possibilities of them at the same time. They've also, if we're thinking about science fiction, fantasy as genres, they've really been sidelined, not considered literary enough. And certainly the same is true for folk tales. Right, this is something that is associated in with Black rural communities, with poor working class communities, and so are definitely not kind of considered to be that kind of literary echelon that we're considering to be the real site of knowledge production, and yet it obviously is. This is where a lot of knowledge is produced, and that's kind of what. Just as speculative fiction is taking us to that place and thinking about how we can learn from the examples in science fiction fantasy, so too, right, can we look at folk tales. In fact, they're meant to oftentimes be instructive. So that's kind of what we're doing today, is really pulling up some of those stories, looking at some of those different types of figures or tropes who show up in those kinds of stories and thinking about what they mean, what they offer us. So Tonia, we each kind of prepared a story. What did you find?
Yeah, so I researched the African side of folklore, specifically from the continent of Africa, to find fairies there. And one thing that I found really, really interesting is, when we're talking about European fairies, often they're evil entities, they're tricksters, in the same way that like Anansi or, something like that is. But in African folklore, fairies are actually very benevolent. So there are two types of fairies. One is called the Aziza, and they're little, furry creatures, with wings. So, they're actually kind of hairy. They're not like they're almost like Tinkerbell in the sense they have like butterfly like wings and things like that, but they're, fuzzy like, Bumblebee might be. And they're incredibly benevolent. So, they live in a forest, and if, say a hunter or, someone like that comes by, they instruct them on how to basically live in the wild and thrive in the wild. So, there's this story that was told about the Aziza, about, a hunter who stumbled upon them, while he was out hunting. And they basically taught him, how to hunt more efficiently, how to build fire. And then, they got to talking about the diseases that, plagued his village. And the Aziza were like, oh, well, here are the herbal remedies for that. And I think, that's going to be tied into something you're going to talk about later with hoodoo in particular. The herbal remedies are, incredibly important. So, this hunter takes this knowledge back to his village of this herbal remedy for, malady that his wife had. And the king is like, wow, we have lots of diseases. How can we go back and talk to these Aziza and, find cures for these diseases? And, basically what happened is these Aziza came up with all these cures for these remedies. And the king, in return, essentially made them gods. And that is where the voodoo gods come from. So Loa and voodoo, not hoodoo, voodoo, actually originated with this tale of the Aziza helping out this village and curing their remedies, and the king essentially making them kings, or not kings, but gods in a way. And then there's also the Yumboy that are talked about. They're a little bit less benevolent. They're not quite as giving as the Aziza were. There's not a lot of folklore about them. Actually, the first mention of them comes from a book by an Irishman that is about mythology across the world. But there is evidence that there was an oral tradition that came from Africa and was, brought over to America with the enslaved. So again, it's really difficult sometimes to find some of this folklore, because especially in African cultures and Native American cultures as well, it's an oral tradition, not a written tradition. So it wasn't until other people started to come in and kind of document these traditions that people actually became aware of them. But the Young Boy were also, very benevolent. Again, not quite as much as the Aziza in that, they were offering, a lot of help. They were just like, leave us be. We'll help you out if you need it, but otherwise we're gonna kind of like stay in our little forest and our little trees and mind our business kind of thing. Whereas the Ziza were more, if you think of like the fictional nation of Wakanda sharing their technology with the world, the Ziza were more like that. They wanted to share their technology, and a lot of people I think don't consider herbal remedies technology because it's not electronic. There's no holograms. It's not sci-fi type stuff, but it's a technology. Even if you can't explain exactly why a herbal remedy works, it's still technology. And so the Azizas shared their technology in the way that the Wakandans did as well. So I'm not sure that there was an intentional parallel between the Aziza and the nation of Wakanda, but there definitely is similarities between them. But going back to the Yumboy, again, they weren't really mentioned in any written way until this Irishman kind of like wrote down this story. But basically, they were from West Senegal, and they were described as sort of spirits of the dead, or ancestors that lived in the forest. So they were benevolent in kind of the way that our ancestors are benevolent. The way that they're used in hoodoo, which again, we'll talk about a little bit later about ancestral worship. These were basically diminutive figures that held the spirits of our ancestors and came over to the new world to help the enslaved and essentially like just take something from home with them over to this new land.
That's interesting. I was thinking as you were talking about the ancestral spirits living in the forest, I have been obsessed for a long time with Tananarive's The Good House. I think I mentioned to you this earlier. And that's exactly where my mind went right there, was to the spot where The Good House, the title is sort of named after this the white family, but really that owned this land. But ultimately it's the land itself and the connection to ancestors, the past, to history, memory, all of those things that is sort of the most important part of that story. So I would be really interested to think about that connection.
Yeah.
I also just want to throw out too that you mentioned voodoo, but that's sort of the pejorative, name for voodoo.
Yes.
So just a quick clarification on that one. But yeah, I think that's really interesting. I didn't know. I would love to know more about that relationship of what did you say it was that through
the king of
celebrating them, sharing their knowledge, that they were brought to the level of
essentially like elevated them to gods. And over time, obviously, they've changed quite a bit. The gods are no longer these furry little creatures with wings that live in the forests. But yeah, I mean that's essentially like the origin of the different deities that are worshipped, and the different aspects of the crossroads and managing helping the dead cross over into the new world and things like that.
Wow. Yeah, I hadn't heard of that one before. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting too. I was like, wait, what? Like, this is where it came from. Something else that's interesting is, there are other figures in African folklore that would not necessarily be considered fairies. So there's the Adsa, which are, small insect-like creatures like fireflies. But they can transform into human form, but they're essentially vampires. So when they're in their firefly form, they go and they, bite people and, feast on their blood. And when they're in human form, they eat the organs of the people that they've hunted. So in a way, they are fae in that, they are, diminutive beings with wings. But they're also very vampiric in nature. And one other aspect to these creatures is that not only do they suck your blood like a vampire does, but they also spread diseases like malaria. So this was the way that the people there kind of explained how malaria, was transmitted amongst the people. Obviously, they didn't have the science to explain, exactly how malaria occurred, and
But
just
they had observation. I mean, that's the technology part you mentioned before. I mean, that's the basic skill of science. I mean, that's the first step.
right,
Attempting to make correlations between
right.
patterns you
Yeah,
observe.
and they did make the correlation between something biting people and giving them malaria. They just kind of gave them vampiric qualities and made them more like fireflies rather than mosquitoes, was how, they explained, much like European cultures explained, like bad air as the way
Right.
that diseases spread, which, essentially is
Yeah,
true.
yes.
People cough and, their germs get into the air. It is bad air. It's just, the things that we cannot see in the air that are
Right.
causing
Yeah.
the diseases. And the last thing that I wanted to bring up, is there were also these small dwarf-like creatures called Biloko. That this folklore comes from Zaire. They were also believed to be the spirits of the ancestors, much like the Yombwe were. But they're a little more vicious. They're hairy, but in a way, like it's actually grass that grows on their body instead of hair. So they were fuzzy like the Aziza were, but with grass instead of hair. They, are very territorial creatures. You come near them and, they viciously guard the animals that they've hunted and killed, the fruits that they've gathered to eat. And people believe that they used bells to sort of entrance the people that came near their area in the forest so that they could consume their flesh, essentially. So
Wow.
again, not
So kind of like sirens in West
yes,
mythology.
exactly. So again, not quite like the traditional fae, like we consider vampires, but small creatures that live in the forest and use some magic, to make things happen. But the thing that I found interesting about the Aziza is that there was no magic with them. It was just knowledge that they had of the living things in the forest and how they could be used to help people and how humans could essentially thrive in the wild and how they could use nature to their advantage, and also hunt as well. So it's not necessarily just using nature to their advantage, but using nature to their advantage in a way that helped them feed their families and cure their ills.
Yeah, wow, that's interesting. When you mentioned the sort of firefly creatures who drink blood, and I was reminded of I'm going to talk about witches, and one of the type of stories that came up in the stories about witches that I found was one about a kind of vampiric witch who this is very interesting. In all these stories I'm reading about witches, they're primarily not interested in just attacking random people. It's oftentimes either someone that they know or they're working to, for their own betterment, or someone has paid them to attack someone else, which I think is very interesting. So, they're not just wantonly destructive creatures looking to kind of destroy. It's I don't know. I mean, the more I read about these witches, I was like, I can absolutely 100% identify with these creatures. Now, but one of the things that came up to kind of come back to this idea of fireflies and blood was that sometimes flashes of light in the distance would be read as like, oh, that's a hag over there. That they would maybe shoot flames from their bums or from their armpits, and that in the distance that would be read as potentially a witch flying through the air, and that also this vampiric witch figure was approached by a woman who was jealous, and jealousy is oftentimes a motivator for these kinds of stories, to win over a man who she was very attracted to, but who loved someone else. So she paid this witch to, or was attempting to pay the witch to kind of, to work her magic against this couple, break them up and turn him towards her. And what the witch wanted was no amount of money, but rather some of her blood. And then in doing that work, she drank the blood and then decided to, here we go. I'm going to give you what you want. Now I've turned this man towards you. And then I think the other woman comes forward then and says, hey, wait a minute. I want him back. And then she gives him the witch some of her blood. And then the witch sort of, undoes that initial work. And ultimately the first person is sort of left in this kind of diminished, unhealthy state, withering away because she's given her blood to feed this witch, who has then kind of double crossed her, working for her own self-interest. So in that way, is certainly a trickster figure. But I think it's very interesting that idea of drinking blood and seeing these sort of flashes flying through the air were translated, across the Atlantic into these stories.
Yeah. I find it interesting too, that you mentioned, essentially using blood as magic, and that's something that exists in every culture. Blood is, incredibly powerful magic, in any culture. You can use herbs and, eye of newt, and all this other stuff. But for, it's usually dark magic that uses blood. And it's, some of the most powerful magic that you can do is using blood, because I think that, a lot of cultures especially believe that the blood is sort of the essence of us. And
Christianity has a lot of blood magic in it.
Yeah.
Like going to drink the blood of Christ every
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
That's in there. Oh.
I had a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So, in your research, were you able to find any kind of shift in like benevolence? So, like maybe with the transatlantic slave trade, more of the stories become like kind of like capitalistic, like
I think that the folklore was definitely colonized in a lot of ways, and I don't think that it was a brainwashing sort of thing. I think it was an issue of survival, that they had to think about hoodoo and any really African religion, like all of these African religions that were brought over to America, essentially worship like saints or figures from the Bible. They transformed the gods that they believed in into these saints, so that they wouldn't die because they were blasphemous or something like that. But the understanding was that the saint was really this god. This is kind of just what we're calling it, and then over time it just became we're worshiping this saint, or we're reciting a psalm as a prayer. So that we can do the work that we want to do without our slave owners killing us, essentially.
And I would say too, not a lot of very few of the fae, supernatural creatures I found are benevolent. They're not all dangerous or wicked. Oftentimes they're sort of morally ambivalent in that very specific trickster way.
Yeah.
But I did not come across I did not come across any stories. It's not to say they're not out there, but I did not see stories of kind of sort of benevolent woodland sprites.
Yeah, like the Aziza. I've never heard of them in African American folklore. I was surprised to find them in African folklore and to really find no corollary and African American folklore. That was just something that, was potentially brought over, but it was, transformed in such a way that you don't really recognize it anymore. Certainly, the Yumwe, the spirits of the dead, that obviously, made it over. We don't necessarily call our ancestors that anymore, and they don't necessarily take that form. But definitely the idea of ancestral worship and our ancestors being there to help us and protect us and to harm those who want to harm us, that definitely made it over.
Yeah, one of the things that I was looking at kind of the slippage between the terms witch, buhag, and then conjurer, which are sometimes used interchangeably. They definitely are different, but they're sometimes used interchangeably. And I think part of that has to do with a lack of clarity and attention on the part of the folklorists and anthropologists for collecting the stories, but also in the kind of communities themselves. That sometimes in the stories themselves they'll use witch once and then use conjurer later, but there are elements of difference. So
I think also, I'm sorry. I think
go
also
ahead.
that essentially, it was mostly white anthropologists who were trying to document Black folklore, and of course, Black people did not trust white folks back then. So they didn't tell them the full tell, and I think they often tried to obscure what was really true, and essentially like tried to mix up things so that white people would not understand what it was specifically that they do, and it remained an oral tradition for Black people. But the stuff that's documented, it doesn't match a lot of.
And there's some really interesting, by the time we get to the 20th century, some very interesting moves by Black folks to start collecting those histories as well. So Anna Julia Cooper, talks about the importance of collecting those folklore stories. And if we're going to make any kind of, from the sort of racial uplift perspective, if we're going to make any inroads in elevating the race, we need to first take account of our own stories, our own perspectives, and learn to appreciate those sort of imaginary places that we come from.
Yeah.
Hampton Institute has got, I think, a giant reserve of folklore from that period, because they started saying, okay, everybody who's here, why don't you start sharing your stories with us? We're going to start recording them, so that everyone kind of became a researcher in that way. And then also you've got like Zora Neale Hurston and some other folks who are Lorenzo Dow Turner, who are also doing that kind of work of gathering folk tales.
Yeah.
In that,
and they were part of the community, so they actually got told the truth about everything. Especially Zora Neale Hurston, she definitely, she was initiated, I believe.
She was,
at some point, as part of her work. Obviously, she was Black, so she was welcomed into the community, and she, showed that she was very serious about understanding what it was and respecting those traditions.
Absolutely. So I think it's really important then to pay attention to, as we're looking at this, as we're doing this research, to also think about, okay, make that momentary pause to think, okay, who did the collecting of these stories? And so how might that have changed? When I read the story over here and I'm reading the reporting of the story and I'm seeing this story over here and I'm hearing it slightly differently, the elements are the same. So I can kind of say that at least, okay, there's sort of some accuracy there.
Yeah.
If this person's putting a spin on it and they're coming from outside of the community, that might raise a little red flag.
Like the serpent and the rainbow, for instance.
Yeah.
Like how much of it is actually true and how much of it was.
I mean, I love Wes Craven, but no.
Yeah.
No. No. And and also of course it was the book before it was the movie. But so if I can share a little bit about the witches and buhags and conjurers. So I've witches, I'll start with that category, because in African American folklore there could be men or women. They oftentimes I've read so many stories about witches slipping out of their skins and then traveling through cracks or keyholes to get into different places. They are notoriously compulsive. So if you put anything down in front of them that has some detail or is more than one object, they have to count it. So there are a lot of kind of anti-witchcraft protection techniques that involve scattering, salts in front of your doorway, that kind of thing, or throwing seeds down or rice down, something that would make a witch stop and have to count those things, and that would kind of give you time maybe to find her skin and salt it or pepper it so that she couldn't re-enter into it, or keep her from riding you at night, that sort of thing. One of the things I thought was really interesting and something that I had not read before, I'd heard about jumping the broom as an African-based marriage ceremony. But one of the things that I had not read about it is that part of its purpose is to potentially save the husband from marrying a witch, because she would have to count the straws on the broom before she could jump over it. And so that gave him a chance to rethink things. It's like, that's interesting. Also the term kind of nightmare, like, this idea of a horse in the nighttime is related to witches who are known to ride people. This shows up again in the idea of a boo hag, but witches also can do this, and sometimes will steal the skin of the person that they're riding in order to wear around during the nighttime. And anybody who wakes up just feeling absolutely sore and, their hair is all tangled and mussed, and they feel like they didn't really get any sleep at all, that's oftentimes expressed as having been ridden by a hag or ridden by a witch. Also, if you wake up, you're kind of experiencing sleep paralysis, you wake up and you can't really move, it's because you're being ridden by a witch. Those are all types of examples. They can be caught by in bottles. So one of the stories I read, and that's the story Macy and the Boo Hag. The way that the mother freed her daughter from being ridden by this witch was to trap her inside throw a needle inside a bottle, and the witch went in there to count it. She's trapped inside the bottle, corked it up really quickly, and then shoved a bunch of needles in the top. Exactly 33, not one more, not one less. And that those needles pointed towards the witch stopped her from doing anything. So there's and there are quite a few stories about witches being able to, or being sucked into bottles and trapped by bottles. In fact, have either of you seen those bottle trees?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that. I live in the South, so there's trees with bottles in them everywhere, and I was wondering if that's why. I knew it had something to do with protection. I didn't know specifically, what it was from, but yeah, and blue as well.
Yeah, it comes from that kind of Gullah culture, hoodoo culture of trapping spirits, evil spirits or witches inside bottles, and during the nighttime, because it's always during the nighttime they get trapped in the bottles. But then as the sun rises, it burns up the spirits inside the bottles with that daylight. So
essentially like vampires, in sunlight, the same.
Yeah.
Same folklore, but these are witches instead of vampires.
Right, yeah, but equally nocturnal.
Yes.
They do all of their mischief happens at night when they can privately slip out of their skin. They are definitely shapeshifters. They might have familiars of some kind, any kind of animal, but and they live solitarily. And I was like, hey, wait a minute, I have a dog. I live by myself. I also am a part of fun organizations. I don't.
Do any of them have plants? Lots of plants?
No, right? Yes. I'm obsessed with gardens. And yeah, sometimes witch might not even know it. She might not even know she's a witch. So, I've got some deep thinking to do about my life and what's happening here. But so that's sort of witches. Now, boo hags are very specifically women. You never see a man who's referred to as a boo hag, but they're not always human. Sometimes they're referred to as evil spirits or people who look like they look like humans during the daytime, but they slip off their skins at night, and they're actually just sort of evil, unwashed, dirty creatures that do a lot of the same things. There's a lot of overlap between buhags and witches in that way. They are they're specifically the term buhag definitely comes from Gullah Geechee culture. That's so you don't really hear buhags referred to. You may now, but previously, in the sort of early to mid 20th century, it was used almost exclusively, in the area of the Sea Islands. And the same types of stories would be told, but would be referring to buhags as witches in other parts of the world. So if you find stories gathered in Michigan and other places, that you're hearing about witches. Equally restless at night, and are obsessed with skins. Now, one of the things that I found was very interesting over and over, salt, is a powerful force. To not only having to count the grains of salt in order to keep the witches at bay, but also the idea of salting or peppering a skin that the buhags have slipped off, that keeps them from being able to re-enter it. And there's so many stories where these witches will call out to their skin, like, skin, why don't you recognize me? I'm trying to come home. What's wrong with you? And I think this very interesting relationship that they have with this body part that they slip off and that they wear kind of as a suit, and yet it is obviously a bigger part of them than just a suit. I mean, it is something that they need to live. If they can't put on their skin, they can't really fully live. So they are very much in between the sort of supernatural world and the human world. They have to walk between two in order to kind of fully live their lives.
Can I say something real quick? I find the salt thing really interesting because in Haitian folklore, somebody can be turned into a zombie, like ZONBI. It's not zombie like, arg, I'm going to eat brain zombie. It's more
Right.
of an allegory to slavery. Someone raises you from the dead essentially, and controls you completely. And one way that a zombie can, regain themselves is if they eat salt. So that really interesting that salt is a way to sort of dispel magic. Salt can be used in a lot of different types of folklore. You behind your doors, like if you've ever watched Supernatural, they rock salt shotguns and lining things with salt, creating circles with salt. It essentially just stops magic. Like if there is salt, there can't be magic. And I find that really interesting. And I wonder if maybe what the origin.
Well, I don't know the origin, but I will speculate that what I'm thinking about is other things that are equally magic. Mirrors, water, and water that can also kind of mirror, blood, as we talked about before. And those things are all things, mirrors are not intrinsic to life, but light is, so we need to breathe air, we need blood to function, we need to drink water, and we need to consume salt. Like without those things, we will die. And so too, like would life on this planet would not exist if we did not have the sun. So and the light from it. So that to me is why I think so many different human cultures find power in those things, because they are so fundamental to life. And I think it's partially the recognition of that leads to elevation and importance through folk tales, and to, like, as part of that kind of knowledge production, making sense of the world. It's like, I recognize these things are really, really important. So absolutely, they are powerful. And I see how they can, you need salt to live, but too much salt in the soil will kill plants and animals. So that kind of balance, I think, is very interesting. And that to me is, in that way, salt is kind of it's a morally neutral kind of thing, similar to a trickster figure. Even though, like, white Europeans really just assumed, oh, well, if you're talking about the trickster, that must be the devil. It must be inherently evil. Like, no, actually, trickster figures can do good things. They can do bad things. They can never entirely be trusted, though.
Right. But they're mostly
That
morally
trickiness of
neutral-ish.
it. So conjurers, that sort of third category, are a little bit different from witches in that, again, there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of slippage. Sometimes they are discussed interchangeably, but they are not always, they don't use, let's see, what's the word? Conjurers use roots. They make charms. They construct different objects and imbue them with some kind of power in order to work the magic. But witches draw on an existing spiritual power. They don't need to make anything or brew anything or have a specific ritual in order to make something work. They just make it happen. They have this existing power already. So, so even though we can kind of talk about them in the same way, and we hear about them the same way, conjurers exist in a sort of different category, and continue to exist. And that kind of brings up some of those, again, that, right, the good and the bad, the harming and healing practices that exist in
Two-headed doctors, yeah.
I've been drawing a lot from Yvonne Chiro's Black Magic, religion and the African American conjuring tradition. It is wonderful. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And she talks a lot about the different ways that folks approached, used, and especially with the harming practices, used hoodoo as a way to fight back, particularly in slavery, right? So if you read about Denmark Vesey, or Vesey, I can't even remember how his last name is pronounced. So, but there was on his team, if you will, right, part of the group of renegades that he was working with, one of them was a fellow named Gullah Jack, and he was a conjurer. So a lot of the success that was attributed to the works that they did kind of came back to this guy, Gullah Jack, that he was able to work some roots and really help folks with to meet their goals. So of course, some of the stories I mentioned, really have this idea that, and Macy and the Boo Hag too, again, jealousy was kind of a key root, that there was a girl in her town who thought that she was, the prettiest girl, and other people, were really interested in her. And so they set a Boo Hag on her in order to kind of get her out of the way. So even though you might want to use this person to harm other people in your community, there is also the idea that you can do sort of harm to people outside of the community in order to protect the larger community, which I think is a very interesting point to bring up, because it gets us a little bit away, I think, from the tendency to demonize, witches and conjuring, and make it and sort of fall into that category that we see in horror films all the time, where it's like, oh, this is an evil witch doctor who is, attempting to destroy everyone. It's a little bit more complicated. In fact, it's a lot more complicated than that, and it's worth mentioning. I don't know if I'm off track, but
I find it incredibly interesting. So even if you are off track, I'd love for you to keep going. Personally, though.
Well, I think we might have to open the floor up for questions.
Yeah, there are a few questions in the chat here, so I can just go through and kind of read those off. The first one is, for those of us unfamiliar with voodoo, which ones have become saints? So,
oh yeah, so I could not find any information on exactly which ones became saints. I don't know if Dr. Jones knows.
That is outside of my my knowledge, but I can tell you, if you're thinking about the in Vodou and like Christianity, the saints kind of one-to-one. If you look up some of the Loas, like the name of the Loas, that's Loas or Lwas. You can find some sources that help kind of map those. It really is, in a lot of ways, a kind of one-to-one. The only figure I'm most familiar with are figures like Papa Laba or Papa Legba. He kind of goes by a lot of different names. He's the keeper of the crossroads. And so he's sort of at that first tier of gods that if you want to appeal to the series of gods beyond, you have to first go to him. So I don't remember how he maps onto larger structures and syncretic religions. I would have to look that up, but
Yeah.
very interesting things. He is a figure that shows up a lot in pop culture, especially recently.
Yeah,
Like
and Baron Samedi as well.
Yeah. Do you remember, what was it? American Horror Story Coven?
Yeah. Yeah.
He showed up, he was in that. He made a deal with the characterization of Marie Laveau and collected babies. I really didn't appreciate that because they really did make him this kind of figure and didn't see that he too is a trickster. So yes, cannot be trusted entirely, but it's not. I mean, I think when we say he's eating babies,
that's
evil. There's no going back from that.
No.
So that was a little heavy-handed.
Yeah. I will say that I think that, and this is just speculation on my part, but I certainly feel that more recently, the traditions have moved away a little bit from Christianity and, sort of pushed more to the forefront, figures like Papa Legba that did not have, corollary as far as like saints go, or, maybe they did and I'm just not aware of them. But, I absolutely feel like, after the slaves were freed and, they kind of had this ability to start being more truthful about their religions. A lot of that saint worship kind of faded and they just kind of like kept some of the saints they didn't have corollaries for in their traditions and sort of combine the two traditions, which is why I think that, there's not a whole lot of like ability to map, one saint to another. I think that if we look back to when Black people were enslaved, that you might be able to find those corollaries. But I think, after they were freed, it was, we're going to do what we want here. And we're just going to like take some things from this religion and keep some things from my own religion and mesh it into one.
They definitely developed under, as part of that transatlantic slave trade and the sort of, cultures, but syncretic religions did take on their own, like they are kind of standalone religions, even though very clearly trace that this came from over here and this came from over here, in ways that we don't talk about. I mean, all religions are syncretic to a certain extent, but to get into the like nitty gritty of the sort of language of it, I don't want to dig too far into that. But I will say that there is more, and when you find Santeria and some other folks, there is in some other kind of African derived religions, you do hear a lot of less invoking of spirits, of saints specifically, and more discussion of Loas, right? And that using that kind of language a little bit more.
Okay, so the next question is, are you aware of any water-based / mermaid fae? The
only one I know of is Mami Wata, and that is that's an African story about a goddess who is the god of waterways, and some other things. You were nodding your head, Tonia. Do you know more about Mami Wata?
I actually could not remember the name, so I was looking it up while we were getting ready to go to the next question, and I'm trying to figure out sex, and fertility were big things that they were kind of called upon for, and healing as well.
Mhm.
That brings up another question, because the person who posed this question actually said she tries not to refer to Mami Wata as a fae, since that's kind of an
God.
actual deity in like
Right.
certain African cultures.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
But that, for me, that brings up the question of like how much, commingling do you
Yeah.
think is kind of going on between some of the kind of fictional fae stories and the actual, like,
Yeah. Well, I think it's very commingled. I think that the idea of artwork, of fiction, of fae and supernatural creatures are, I mean, it's just the difference between what do you want to call supernatural, you know what I mean? Like, what do you want to call supernatural? What do you want to call religious? Like, these exist in the same cosmology. These exist in the same, in the same story. So we have ideas, we have stories about mermaids that exist in Western culture as these sort of fictional characters, and that's what we think of when we think of folklore. But when we think of religions, we think of these whatever they are, deities or characters or what have you, as really literally existing. So I don't think when we're talking about African derived religion, we're talking about African religions, we're talking about African American, religions of folklore, that if we're looking at it from an Afrocentric perspective, I don't think that we can distinguish those things so quickly. You know what I mean? So finely. I think that we really have to look a little bit more broader. And I understand the concern, not wanting to, by sort of thinking about those things in the same framework. Hey, wait a minute. Aren't I suggesting that these deities are not as real as my deity, or as deities that come from this sort of Western framework? And I think that, yes, I understand that. And if you're looking from a Eurocentric perspective, then absolutely that is a potential that could happen. But if you're looking at the frame from inside itself and taking it on its own terms, then no. Does that make sense?
yeah.
Hannah?
Makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I was gonna kind of take a different approach to that question in terms of fae, are they deities or not? Again, back to the Aziza, how they were kind of transformed into deities, and again, there's not a lot of information on specifically which deities they became, but I would imagine that because they are from nature and concerned with herbal remedies and healing and being one with nature, I would expect that those were the deities that they kind of became in these different religions, and these are not the only ones by any means, that's just the only fae that became deities. But obviously there are other deities within Vodou and all of that don't come from the Aziza.
Okay, so another question. What books, resources would you recommend for people trying to learn more? I know you just held up one.
I did. I'll hold it up again. Yvonne Chirot's Black Magic. That's religion and the African American conjuring tradition. Natrice Gaskins published something about Mami Wata not too long ago that I thought was pretty interesting. What else have I been reading? I've been reading a lot about, let's see, I've got, in terms of folk tales, I've got this beast, the African American, annotated African American folk tales book, edited by Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Maria Tartar, or Tatar. I've been reading a number of other things. I'm trying to think offhand. A lot of what I do is in speculative fiction, so I was sort of dipping into some of that as well. Do you have any resources, Tonia, that you would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like Zora Neale Hurston's, Tell My Horse is a good one. What's that one? Oh God, I've got it on my bookshelf. What is it? Every Tongue Got to Confess.
Ah, yes.
It's another Mules and Men. Sorry, I'm turned around looking at my bookshelf. But really, any of those. And reading her essays that have been published in journals, and they're available online. Reading any of those, I think, is a good resource. In terms of something more modern, I was just looking this up. I've read this book called Mojo Working, The
Oh,
Old
yeah.
American Hoodoo System by Katrina Hazard Donald.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I'll drop her name in the chat because it's spelled just a little bit differently than you would expect. Oh wait, no, I can't.
Oh.
I lied. But it's like Hazard with two Z's. Katrina Hazard with two Z's dash Donald. Mojo Working is a really good book. But I think honestly, like Zora Neale Hurston's work is probably number one go-to that I would recommend.
This one, Talking to the Dead, relatively new. This one's Religion, Music, and Lived Memory Among Gullah Geechee Women. And that's by LaRonda S. Manigault Bryant. That's Talking to the Dead. That one is really useful. And also, since you mentioned Zora Neale Hurston and some of the stories that I saw in these various collections of Virginia Hamilton has a collection too of African American folk tales, I think called Her Tales, or specifically really focused on stories about women that also kind of do exactly what I was mentioning. It's about, there's true tales, folk tales, and these other kind of stories that put together side by side lived experiences of women, stories about women, those sorts of things. So attempt to use that kind of Afrocentric frame to not take apart those things and say, well, this is true and this is not true. It lets them exist side by side in this kind of uneasy space. So that I think is a useful one. The collected slave narratives from the WPA, you can still find in the Library of Congress. You can listen to recordings of those. You'll sometimes find some folk stories in those. And like I said, the archives, I'm not sure if any of those archives have been made digital, but if you're interested in doing that kind of archival work, the Hampton Institute is a place that you could go to read some of those as well.
Okay, we have time for one.
Can I have one more book? I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
This one, Darkly. I'm trying to turn it right. By Layla Taylor. It's Black history and the American Gothic soul. So it's kind of about how Black people kind of worked around white supremacy and still maintain sort of this Gothic nature. So it does touch a little bit on folklore, but it's more from the lens of how we've navigated as a people around white supremacy and colonialism.
Right. Kenitra Brooks would be a great one for that too. And also I lost her name. Okay, it'll come back to me. I'll just post it in the thing later.
Okay.
But yeah.
One more question.
So we've got time for one more question. So aside from programs like this and excellent podcasts like Nightlight, how can we revive and reclaim the oral folklore traditions in our communities? What should we be searching out?
Fire
That is a
magazine.
great question.
Fire
And
magazine.
one of the things that I was looking at this book of it was like a giant encyclopedia of folklore. It's like three giant sort of pieces. And one of the entries was called Porch Sitters. And just that sort of tradition of sitting on the porch on a hot night, you're letting the house cool down, you're sitting there, and that is a time to share stories. And I think about people sitting outside on the stoop, and like that I still see folks on, like in my neighborhood, I live in College Hill, like sitting outside, sitting on the corner, like just talking to each other, sharing stories. I think that any time we get together is an opportunity, like as Black folks, is an opportunity to share stories, is participating in a continuing oral tradition and to revive some of those stories by sharing these tales with each other. I think children's books. I know Renee, you work for the library, so you're tuned into this. There was a really interesting children's book that I saw called oh boy, it was called Something in the Boo Hag. Was it Renee in the Boo Hag? Did I just make that up? Maybe because your name's Renee? I don't remember. It is available on Amazon if anyone wants to Google it. But it's a short story about
Precious and the Boo Hag.
What is it?
Precious and the Boo Hag.
Precious and the Boo Hag. Yep, totally made up. Renee. That is not not the good. But Precious is left alone, and at her house, she's asked to kind of stay alone when everyone has to leave, and don't answer the door for anybody. And this Boo Hag approaches and multiple times shapeshifts and attempts to get into the house. But Precious is able to use her knowledge of folklore, her, and her own kind of wit in order to outsmart the Boo Hag and keep herself safe.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a really sort of powerful statement, that what we know about our past and our own stories and where we come from is a kind of balm of protection for what seeks to harm us in this world. And so I think sharing stories like that, buying those kinds of books for children, sharing those stories with children, with each other, are always useful. I'll give a plug for Africana Studies, in school, take some of those classes. If, agitate for those classes to be taught in K through 12. Oh my God, critical race theory, what? All right, but yes, we need to have those classes everywhere. So it shouldn't just be something that is an elective that you take when if you get to go to college. So I think those are other places. Also, there are, local griots, local theater companies. That was something that the Midwest Black Speculative Fiction Alliance did a couple weeks ago, connected with, Black theater companies who are performing these folk tales and talking about their significance and their meaning. So there are, I think, lots of different ways that these oral traditions continue. And I think, if we can find ways to amplify those existing voices and share these stories more widely, that's a great way to go.
Yeah. I would add Eden Royce's Root Magic as a middle grade novel, where, the main character is also dealing with a Boo Hag and, grief of, losing her grandmother. Excellent book. Highly recommend. Really anything Eden Royce writes is, going to delve deeply into folklore. She's part of the Gullah Geechee culture. Fire Magazine is a great fiction magazine, all Black writers. Again, I think, like what it really comes down to is listening to Black people talk about how they've grown up, what culture they grew up in, and, sharing their stories, and not buying books by white writers about the culture, getting it straight from the source. And there are a lot of books, even, self-published out there of, people who have change their names to make them sound more Black, but they're really, these white people who are just trying to capitalize off of, hoodoo and things like that. So, just make sure that you're consuming art from, and created by Black people, I think is what it all boils down to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we are going to wrap this up. I just wanted to say thank you this is a very interesting conversation. And for those of you who are watching or who will watch this later, feel free to reach out to us on our Facebook page, Midwest BSFA, and let us know if you have any additional questions that we may be able to pass along to some folks or to answer. Just to end, where can people find you?
You can reach me by email at cassandra.jones@uc.edu. I'm trying not to do social media too much anymore. I primarily just show pictures of my garden now and then read about the atrocities of the world and other places. So that's pretty much it. Basically email.
Well, I'm all over social media.
You can friend me on Facebook.
Yeah. I'm all over social media. I feel like I kind of have to be to promote the podcast. You can find Nightlight Podcast at Nightlight Pod on Twitter or Instagram. You can find me specifically on Twitter or Instagram at Mystifying, MISSDEFYING. So like Miss Defying. I'm also getting ready to start a new podcast called Afflicted that is about hoodoo, which I'm really, really excited about. So you can follow us at Afflicted Audio on Twitter and Instagram.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
So the last thing, Midwest BSFA is doing one last program this is a surprise program to kind of wrap up Black Fae May. We will be getting dressed up in costume and we will be roller skating at an outdoor mobile skating rink on May 27th at 6 p.m. Court Street Plaza, downtown Cincinnati. You want more information? You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Midwest BSFA. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.